I think nearly everybody has had a promise broken. What? Remember, I want to tell you this, but now you promise not to tell anybody. Remember, as kids, cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye. Or I had my fingers crossed behind my back. That cancels it out. When someone promises they will keep what is personal, then breaks that promise, it can be heart-wrenching. You tell someone, it's like they couldn't wait to go tell some others. Have you ever broke a promise? That may have. I'm not asking for raising hands, but ever broken a promise? Felt pretty bad when we did. I'm gonna tell you this, but don't tell anybody. Well, you can't ever get it out of their mouth until they're off telling someone.
Don't tell Michelle Marquise.
Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's almost like that hee-haw list close the first time.
Yeah. Right. But then you'll like I said, tell someone. Say, let me tell you what so and so told me, but now don't you tell anyone. You remember the game we used to call it whisper or gossip, where we'd sit around in a circle in chairs and we'd start at somebody would whisper something in the first one's ear, and then they'd go around whispering. By the time it got back around, it was entirely different than what it started with. What? Oh yeah, yeah, I know. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You do it when you're a preschool teacher, too.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, I always said to fishermen, I caught a fish that far, that big. Isn't that right, JC? Mm-hmm. Well, that's the kind of really, that's maybe like a preacher. That's a license to kind of stretch the truth. Is a fisherman,
F.A. is it kind of like going fishing because I've been taught to fish.
Mm-hmm.
And I've lived on fish. But
Right.
nope. Wonder how
Okay. But I can remember it's that mischievous part in me. I can remember there's always somebody in school that couldn't keep a secret, and I'd make something up and tell them, and just to see how by that afternoon it's all over school.
What's funny is years ago when we were doing children youth ministry, we called it telephone or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
And we start that on one end of the circle, and by the time we get around, say, okay, what did you hear? Well, and the person next to me, that's not what I told you.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, I can remember talking about telephone party lines. One thing, that got all over town too sometimes. And
All those clicks on the phone weren't.
oh yeah, right. You hear a call and you hear all that clicking.
especially the one that's on the wall.
Yeah, that's how Mother found out my brother was drag racing.
Now all those clicks are just the NSA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'll never. Yeah.
Line and we'd go get on the phone because we're on our party line with people that live street behind us. They were ladies that we overviewed. Mama found out we were listening. We were allowed to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll never forget one quick one. I said my mother found out my brother was drag racing, and at the supper table, she was kind of letting him have it. Daddy was sitting there eating his meal, and she said, "Now, what do you got to say to him?" He said, "Did you win?" He said, "Yes." He said, "When you start getting beat, I want you to quit." Oh, Mother just she went. But God has made a promise to us that we can depend on Him to keep. But the promise He gave us, we're not to keep, but to share it with others. That's to me is a reversal of what we, like I said, we was talking about keeping a promise. God's kept His promise to us, but that promise that He's given us, we're to share it with others. And but so when we get into our lesson text, like I said, we could have just stayed on verses 1 through 10, but someone read Psalm 132, 1 through 10.
Lord, remember David and all of his hardships he endured, and how he swore an oath to the Lord, making a vow to the God of Jacob. I will not enter my house or get into my bed. I will not allow my eyes to sleep, or my eyelids to slumber,
They're close. That other town.
Ajar. Let's go to his dwelling place. Let's worship at his footstool. Rise up, Lord. Come to your resting place, you and your powerful ark. May your priests be clothed with righteousness, and may your faithful people shout for joy. For the sake of your servant David, do not reject his
You know, Psalm 132 is part of it's called a collection of psalms called the Songs of Ascents. This is Psalms 120 through 34. And while not absolutely certain, it is thought that the Songs of the Ascents were sung by groups of believers who journeyed to Jerusalem during one of the pilgrims' feasts. Now, the attendees would ceremoniously wash at the pool of Siloam, then ascend the rather steep road through the, and I've never heard of this one, north through the Tyropoeon Valley to the Temple Mount. In other words, ascent, what we're talking about, 132 is one of the longest of these songs of ascents and is one of the most important messianic psalms of the Bible. As I said before, in biblical times, no matter what direction you're going toward Jerusalem, you were referred to as going up. You're ascending into Jerusalem. Didn't matter whether he's going down it or whatever, you were ascending because that was the focal point. You ascended up to Jerusalem. And I'm one that, I'm kind of a stickler, I'm going up to Dallas, I'm going down to Austin. And some is just, everybody's going down. Yes. But I don't know. That's another one of my little pet peeves, that we're going. But I think that's another one of them non-essentials, isn't it? But everyone said they ascended. As they ascended to Jerusalem, they sang these songs. And Jerusalem was the religious hub of the center for the Jewish people. Now, the psalm emphasized loving devotion, worship, joyful righteousness, prayer, obedience, trust, and faith. While Psalm 132 was written, when it was written, it's really uncertain. We don't know it was written during the time of was it written during the time of the first temple stood in Jerusalem? Or was it written after the second temple was constructed by Jews who had returned from the captivity in Babylon? Now, because the psalmist longed for the appearance of the Messiah, many suggest that the psalm was written after the second temple was completed, in the time when there was no Davidic, I can't say it, king. I kind of tend to believe this, that it was written after the exile in Babylon. But we don't know for sure. But you said, but it says, all the hardships of he, or David, endured. David experienced many hardships throughout his life. To name a few, remember Saul's attempts to kill him? He'd even had it I think Saul had bipolar. I don't know, sometimes he was fine, sometimes he was just off his rocker. And there's times he threw the spear at David, trying to kill him. And he tried to hunt him down, trying to kill him. That's one of the hardships that David kind of suffered through. When he was appointed as king, everything wasn't just wine and roses. He went through hardships and through trials. But he had poor life choices, the hardships. For instance, his adulterous act with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah. I always remember when Nathan came to him and said, told him about this guy, this rich man took the one sheep, and David said, I'm going to kill him. He said, it's you. I always thought Nathan had a lot of nerve, or he was God was with him. I think what it was. What? For sure. But last but not least, remember his son Absalom plotted to take over the kingdom. He even tried to kill him. And it ended in the death of Absalom. Remember David said, don't kill him. Well, I don't know if he didn't hear the command or whatever, but one of Absalom's got his hair caught in a tree. But one of the suspended in there. That's why I said, well, I'm not going to touch that. I look around, I'm not going to. There's no danger of something getting the hair caught in this. But anyway, and I always thought, of course, like I said, Absalom was out to overthrow him and to kill him. But what did David? He mourned for his death when he died. I always remember the words, Absalom, Absalom, my son Absalom. Mourned for his death. But it was David's desire to build the temple to the Lord Jehovah, to make a vow to the mighty one of Jacob, or Israel. He would not rest until the temple was built and have a resting place for the Ark of the Covenant. Until I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling place for the mighty one of Jacob. David was absolutely dedicated to building God's temple and a dwelling place. David's dedication to this was so complete that he vowed to refuse himself of any comforts in life until the job was finished. One problem, wasn't it? He wasn't to build it. David even purchased, they said, the land, bought all the materials and everything to build the temple. And then he even acquired from the prophet Nathan to get his approval, so to speak. What Nathan tell David? Go ahead, build it. The Lord is with you. I believe there's a great lesson in us today in this. Nathan told David, and the great prophet, I think the great prophet Nathan, he's told David to go ahead without consulting the Lord or getting his approval. How many times have we as a church, or churches said, we did decide to do something and we didn't pray it through or pray about it or get God's approval? So let's just go ahead and do it. God's in it. And we see that here as a lesson that Nathan told him, said, God is in this. Go ahead and start building it. But what happened? That night the Lord spoke to Nathan. And Nathan told him to go to David, and in short, he will not build the temple, but his son. That's probably kind of disheartening and disappointing to David in a way. What was his son? I don't know the scripture, but he said he was God's warrior. And is why it's one reason he didn't want him to build it. But he said his son Solomon, the next king, will build the temple in 2 Samuel 7. We've covered that in our Bible study at night. But we need to appreciate David's passion to serve and glorify the Lord as we should. And I think we should appreciate the passion we have for it, to serve. But sometimes we get ahead of ourselves or get ahead of God and say, oh, we know God is in this, we're going to do it. Or we do that and they say, God, we want your blessings on this. We're going to do this and that, but we want your blessings. I was talking to Brother Steve yesterday, when we built the educational building. I'll confess, I wasn't real crazy about us doing it. I didn't know if we were ready. But we went ahead, the church voted to build it, and I can see, I was wrong. I believe God was in it. It's paid off. Yes, it's paid off. And we paid it off, like you said, real quick. I guess that was one of my biggest concerns, is how we're going to pay for this. But it was paid off in, less than a year. And so it was paid off. And God laid out everything. We had that Christian builders came and built it. Oh, everything just went perfect. Everything, and
I can't imagine trying to have a fellowship.
oh yeah, just in here.
As small as it was before.
That was small. That was a fellowship hall and 3 classrooms. Wow. Yes. So you can imagine trying to have VBS or a fellowship in this, but God was in it, and I see that now. Like I said, maybe it's some of my stubbornness, but believe that or not, but like I said, we need to be careful not to get ahead of the Lord. She dropped her book, Butch, if you would. She just wanted to see if you can bend that far, Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But we need to be careful not to construct memorials to ourselves. We've seen that happen. Amen. Many of them. I remember several years ago, and I read this, excuse me, in the Baptist Standard, but there was, and I won't say where, but there was 2 major Baptist churches in the city, and one of them built a beautiful fountain in front of their church. Not to be outdone, another church in the same city built a larger fountain in front of their church. Well, that's not as bad as, but what was sad, though, they quit giving the cooperative program admissions until they could get the cost of the fountain paid off. I mean, they said this. I mean, I read this, and like I said, that's been 40 years ago or more. But for them to even do that and even have the gall to say we quit giving to missions, and so until we can afford to pay it off that fountain. I mean, and like I said, we're guilty. Many churches are guilty of some of these cathedrals, some of these mega churches, and it makes you even wonder. Some of them are these memorials that they're building to themselves. Yeah, while they're starving across the street. Yes, yes. Speaking of that reminded me of a story. Sorry, brothers. There was a church, I think it was around the Fort Worth, Dallas area, that was thriving, but there was a church down the street, and they were about to go under, and the pastor of this church was friends or with this church that was about to go under. And they decided, they thought, well, we could take that church in and make it a part of our church. But the church and the pastor got to praying about it, and this is a lot of faith. He said one Sunday, he announced, I think it's 10 or 12 of my best givers and my best servers to come forward and dedicate themselves to go to that church. And they're both thriving today. But I thought, boy, for a preacher to get up there, I want some of my best servers to go to this other church. Yeah, don't get any ideas. But that was faith and praying through it. But it said both churches, as far as I know, they are thriving. They're doing great. But they could have just taken the church in and made it a part, just making that like a satellite church or something.
On that line, I personally believe instead of these mega churches, they need to start mission churches.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's what they need to do, reach out to these other neighborhoods
Yeah.
where they're not reaching with a
Yeah.
church.
Well, and you talking about that, and I think, and I like him, the Ed Young Sr., but there's 7 campuses in Houston of his churches. I mean, that's, like you said, they need to be mission churches. I think when you get over 300 or 150 or 300, you need to split. You need to start another church, I believe. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, how can you, well, I've joked with Lou Ellis sometimes, let's go join a big church and get lost in it.
I heard someone tell me that.
Yeah.
Went over to Rockwall and
Mm-hmm.
there's a big one there.
Yeah.
Why would you even miss that?
Right. Yes. Right. Yes.
You don't have to serve.
Yes. But and I don't know. To me, verse 10 is in this section here, and I think they should have gone into the next section, but because we seem to take a little different turn in verse 10. And the psalmist requested of the Lord, for the sake of David your servant, do not reject your anointed one. God promised that he would not forsake the sons of David in 2 Samuel 7:14 through 16. I'm ready to get to that. We haven't got to that yet, have we? Yeah, I'm anxious to get to that chapter 7. But when the psalmist prayed this, he prayed for the fulfillment of a promise God had already made. For his sake, all those who are anointed in him are accepted. God bless Solomon and succeeding kings for David's sake, and he will bless us for Jesus' sake. That's a quote by Spurgeon. Do not turn away the face of your anointed. The singer asked that the favor of God would never be taken from his anointed. There is a sense in which every king of David's line was God's anointed, but this looks to the ultimate anointed one, the Messiah himself, Jesus Christ. This is ultimately a prayer for blessing on God's Messiah, the anointed Son of David. Someone read now verses 11 through 14.
The Lord hath sworn in truth unto David, he will not turn from it of the fruit of thy body while I sit upon thy throne. If thy children will keep my covenant and my testimony that I shall teach them, their children shall also sit upon my throne forevermore. For the Lord hath chosen Zion, he hath desired it to be his habitation. This is my rest forever. Here will I dwell, for I have desired it.
The Lord swore an oath to David in 2 Samuel 7. God would not abandon or turn back on his promise. You know, that's something that we can, that we can have comfort in or in faith, that God will not turn his back on his promise to us. And as earlier noted, God told David he would not build a house of the Lord, but rather the Lord would build a house for David. This oath was fulfilled to David's heir, Solomon. So I'm going to read 1 Kings 8:20.
Now the Lord has fulfilled his word, which he spoke. For I have risen in place of my father David, and sit on the throne of Israel, as the Lord promised, and have built the house for the same of the Lord, the God of Israel.
You know, as all that saying, we can take that to the bank, and we can count on God's promise. God does not break a promise. Solomon also noted in verse 21, I have provided a place for the ark where the Lord's covenant is, that he made with our ancestors, for the Lord has chosen Zion. You know, David wanted a place for the ark. It was in a tent. And he said, we need a permanent place for the ark of the covenant. It says Zion is a synonym for Jerusalem. Is also mentioned in another psalm of ascent, Psalm 134:3.
The Lord has made heaven and earth, bless thee, out of Zion.
Another psalm of ascent in 134. God could have chose any city he so desired, but this is his home. He could have chose any city he wanted to, but he chose Jerusalem as his home. The Bible first mentions Zion during David's conquest of Jerusalem in 2 Samuel 5:6-10. David conquered the citadel or stronghold of Zion and changed the name to the city of David. You know, we always refer to Jerusalem now as the city of David. The citadel was a defensive structure on the high hill on the southeast side of the city. Psalms uses the word Zion more than any other book in the Bible, with the exception of Isaiah. In the book of Psalms, Zion symbolizes the rule of God in Jerusalem. It says, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain, Psalm 2:6. When Solomon dedicated the temple in Jerusalem, he made clear that God could not be confined to a particular location. You know, we've thought about how can God be confined to a particular location? You know, when they were in the desert, they built a temple where God was confined there, but that doesn't mean he was confined. That's where it's for us or them, where we can relate to where God is. The entire earth could not contain God, nor the highest heaven. 1 Kings 8:27.
But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, the heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house which I have built?
You know, we spoke about this in previous lessons. God, he's everywhere. In the mass of the universe. You know, what did we say? I think last week, in the earth, the way he set the earth and all the planets in place. That we rotate around the moon. I think, I forget, I've read it before. If we got out of kilter just a little bit, we'd be flying off into space. And we're held in there, you know, and I still can't get over that. We're traveling at 67,000 miles an hour. Where's the handrails? Yeah. Yeah, it's just beyond my comprehensions, but my pay grade, what to say. But we just go, I don't know how far, there's no stopping as far as to the universe. It goes on and on and on. You know, I said before, you know, I said in the last lesson when the Russian cosmonauts went up there and come back and said, we didn't see God in there anywhere.
Then you wonder how in the world can he be everywhere?
Yeah, yes, because he's God. He said, like I said, he said when Moses said, who do I tell them who this is? He said, I am. I am. That sums it up. Omnipresent, omnipotent, everything. But when Solomon dedicated the temple, I already read that, didn't I? In 1 Peter 2:6, Peter described Jesus as the very cornerstone of Zion. If the sovereign Lord of the universe does not require a place to rest, what does the statement, this is my resting place forever mean? God described the promised land as a place to rest and an inheritance for the people of Israel after their exodus from Egypt in Deuteronomy 12:10. That inheritance, among other things, was the land that the Israelites could call home. They were his people. That's why it was considered really his resting place. They can still call it home today. Even if all the unrest that's going on in the Middle East today, God has not forgotten Israel's home. And it is still God's resting place. It's a place that we can relate. That God, that's still God's home, his resting place. It's Israel's resting place. And no matter what's going on over there or how bad it may get, God has not forgot that is his place and that is his people. You know, and it really bothers me that we have so many now in the United States that are anti-Israel. I think even some, and I've even read or heard some, a lot of your Jews here that they could care less about Israel. They're thinking about making money. But and that's disheartening or sad to me that we have Jews here that could care less what happens to Israel. Bad theology, yes. But that's their home. Remember that was, I can always get the date wrong, 46? 48. I always want to get that wrong. They got their land back, their home back. And they still don't have all their home, what's promised them. It will happen. It's going to happen. You know, this saying that some of them say from the river to the sea, well, I'm sorry to inform them, it's not theirs.
That song, I'm just passing through that field.
Yes, yes. But even with all, like I said, the Lord's resting place describes a dedicated place where God's name would dwell. His home, the Lord made his home in Zion, not because he needed to do it, but rather because he desired to and chose to do it. You know, that's a good point there, I think. Not because he needed to do it, but because he desired to and because he chose to do it. Someone read now verses 17 through 18.
There I will make a horn grow for David. I have prepared the lamb for my anointed one. I will clothe his enemies with shame, but the crown he wears will be glorious.
You know, they skip verses 15 through 16 in our lesson text, but I want to briefly look at these two verses. Verse 15 and 16 speaks to God's abundant blessings on Zion, including provisions for the poor and the clothing of priests with salvation. It highlights God's faithfulness to his covenant and the joy experienced by his people as a result. Now in verse 17, the horn was a symbol of power based on the strength of the animal to which it belonged. Horns that grow to massive size depict strength and majesty. I've ever seen some of these programs on TV about the wildlife. You've seen these bighorn sheep when they fight. You'll see it in slow motion when they run and hit the horns. I mean, their whole body just vibrates when they hit them. And yes, he did keep them in place. Yes, I don't know how, like I said, well, they say there's built in their head. There's like a cushion in there, but. I've been buddied by goats before, and I know when I was Christian and Tyler, they were little. I was going to haul some cows off one day, and he was over going to help me, and I was trying to get the goats out of the pen, and I had a bucket of feed, and one of the goats butted me in the back of my leg, and down I went, and I broke my wrist. I told the I said, I went back. I said, I think you better take me to the doctor. You want to go to the emergency? No, I'd already had around the emergency. We're going to my doctor. We're going to walk in. But anyway, he said I'd fractured my wrist. There's still a little old knot there. But anyway, you know, when we feel, I experienced the power of the horns. And we see that, and it is a symbol of power and strength. But it was also a warning of imminent danger when they blew the horn, or called troops to battle. They used the horns. You know, I think I can picture this on these watchtowers where they had probably used a horn. If they saw danger coming, they blew the horn as a warning. The horns they were filled with oil. Some of them were used to anoint kings and priests and prophets to sacred offices. In 1 Samuel, here we go in 1 Samuel again. 1 Samuel 16:12 through 13, Samuel anoints David as king of Israel. I think probably the most significant in the Old Testament. When he anointed, and remember the story, he told his father to bring all the brothers, and he brought it. Well, there's one more somewhere. Where is he? Oh, well, he's out tending the sheep. We'll bring him here. He was just a little kid. Really, I don't remember how old he was, but he was young. But he was tending the sheep. He said, "This is God's anointed. This is God." And Samuel anointed David as king. Probably, like I said, but Psalm 148:14 celebrates that God raised up a horn for his people. When Zechariah prophesied after his son John's birth, he affirmed that God had raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David. Luke 1:68 and 69. John the Baptist would be the prophet and forerunner of the Messiah. John would give his people knowledge of salvation through the forgiveness of their sins, which would come through the Messiah, Jesus. Aaron and his sons were to tend the lamp in the tabernacle so it would never go out. In Exodus 27:20 through 21. Remember, that was one of the duties in the tabernacle. That light, that candle, that light would never go out. You know, I thought, what would happen if they let it go out? Probably, that's not good. But anyway, it never went out. And the continually burning lamp symbolized God's constant presence. God prepared a lamp for his anointed one. The symbolism remains the same. A continuously burning lamp signifies permanence. The line of David, his anointed, will never be extinguished. God gave David and his descendants a lamp, meaning that the reign of David's son would continue constantly. Clothed refers to the Messiah's enemies. God promised to clothe the enemies of his anointed one with shame. The Hebrew term for shame refers to disgrace and humiliation. It is used in the Psalms to refer to both the shame of the psalmist and in prayers for the shaming of the psalmist's enemies. The crown is symbolic of one who is consecrated, set apart for God. The Roman soldiers put a crown of thorns on Jesus' head at his trial. The crown is also a sign of dominion and rule. When Jesus returns, he will have many crowns on his head, but there won't be a crown of thorns. We got several minutes here. Finished early. Open for comments.
We continue that light today.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
It's a good thing those horns were not straight.
Yes. I thought, and all the kings were anointed, but that didn't mean they followed God's will. We may sometimes as Christians, we're God's anointed, but we may not always follow his will. Human. When they go back to that getting ahead of God, that's talking about. Like sheep. We've gone astray. I've always said, I know why God used sheep as an example. Is there, what? Sure. Yes. Yeah. More than one. How many? I always kind of felt sorry for him. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, sir. I don't know. It just, yeah. Yeah, at least by the third one he figured it out. Yeah. David didn't figure it out either. I mean, he had what, 3, 4, something like that. Is Solomon's, Saul's daughter, Bathsheba, and then Abigail. Yeah, there were several. Yeah, and look what it got him. I remember, I'll never forget, and this is not in light of David, but I'll never forget when we went to Tennessee to visit my sister. It was on Father's Day. And I never forget, that's all I remember of the sermon, but I'll never forget he preached a sermon on David and Absalom. And he said, David was the man after God's own heart, the greatest king, but he failed as a father. And you think about that. I mean, it's not giving light to David, but how great a man he was. Like I said, he was a man after God's own heart. But look what happened.
He went outside of God's design for the family.
Yes.
He only pulled one woman out of his rib.
Right. Yes. That's true. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Well. Yeah. Remember, you're working with her today. But you know, I had a friend ask me one time, why did God allow of old allow to marry more than one wife? I said, never did say he allowed it. I don't think he never did allow it. I don't think it was God. It was the man's own judgment in what he did. God never allowed it.
He had 7 total.
7.
And later on, like, took a few more.
Took a few more. Well, Abraham had more than one. I mean, of course, I think he waited for Sarah to die, but of course he got, Sarah's maid, but Hagar. But he did marry after Sarah died. But like I said, at least waited on her to die. But yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Michelle comes in. I'm ready to go out, get my
Mm-hmm.
help with all of this. She said, Molly, somehow Bob had picked up a light. Praise the Lord, he did not have his oxygen on.
Yeah.
She said he lit that little lighter and it hit his face.
Mm.
She said if he had that oxygen on, I wouldn't be sitting.
Yeah. Mm. Well, that's God's intervention. Yeah. Well, it's God's intervention.
What she needs to do is get
Mhm.
away from her trouble. She watched too much Vietnam people.
Yeah.
She needs to sit in there and say,
Right.
I think we better move this.
Yes.
Don't tell work
Mhm.
him because his mind is
Right.
here and there and yonder.
Mm-hmm.
But this is that I almost went to heaven.
Yeah.
The whole
Well, that wouldn't have been so bad, but still it wouldn't. But talking about his wives, I was finding that Bob Harrington, the evangelist, I heard him preach a sermon one time. How do you know you're married to the right person? And he summed it all up at the end. If you're married to the right person. Yeah. There's a lot of truth to that. A lot of truth. And yeah. Yeah.
he wanted to be in church,
Yeah.
but he had COPD.
Right.
He wanted to be
Right. That's true. And but we
in a marriage.
huh?
When you get married, when we got married young,
Mm-hmm.
you find that we made each other stronger.
Mm-hmm.
I made him softer,
Yeah.
but he made me stronger.
Mhm.
You balance each other out,
Mm-hmm.
and one shouldn't be way stronger than the other.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is pounding down, but I think that's what a marriage should be.
Oh yeah.
When
It,
I first got married, I used to say something, and I wasn't even trying to be hard.
mm-hmm.
I'd be like,
Well, that's
Yeah.
how I was.
now I can just say good morning.
Yeah. Did you hear that? Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I know. Give them. You got to give them their space. Yeah.
Well, look at it, you've been married as long as you have. I've been 32 years. She's got it all. She knows how I'm going to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I always get the last word.
Yeah. Yes, dear. Yeah. Yeah. I was talking the other day. Talking about we're going on 58, 59. Okay, 59 years. And I told him, I said, she said, well, I was 16 when we married. I said, don't believe that marrying them young and you can train them all you want. That don't work. Yeah.
I never even fought when we got married. He'd have to follow me into each room and make me talk.
Mm-hmm.
So that was really bad.
Yeah.
When I learned to talk,
Yeah.
I didn't have to learn to get
Oh, we didn't have that problem. We had that.
Bill used to say, I'm married her young so I could train her like I wanted.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Somehow
It failed. I did too. I did too. I failed too. I didn't train them.
We better, put the shovels away.
Yeah, we better put the shovels away. Yeah. We still got a few more minutes. Anybody else like to, if we get off on another subject here? Mm-hmm.
It's funny how people think, oh, they'll never last, they'll never last.
Yeah.
They're too young.
Yeah, that's what they said to us. It never lasts. And,
It's a lot.
yeah. Yeah, I always remember.
You know, sometimes you think it's gonna last, but when it gets going, because mine with the kid's daddy, it was a life and death situation.
Yeah.
This is what
Right.
God, you know.
Some of you don't remember, but you weren't here, but remember Roger and Diane. I always never forget. I think when their anniversary, of course, he was comical. He had a dry sense of humor. And he got up there, I think it's their 30th anniversary. He got up there, he said, been married 30 years, the best 20 years of my life. What? They were, yeah. We all knew he was joking. Okay, Les, would you dismiss us, please?
Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this day that we come to worship your word, Lord, and understand who you are, Father. Father, we just want to thank you for all that you do, and Father, we just pray for Israel. We pray for our brothers and sisters
Yes.
around the world who are going through calamities, Father, that we're just not hearing so much about it. But Father, we know it's happening. We just have to be with them. And Lord, we just prayed for our baptism today, Lord, that this is a glorious thing